Back about 10 years or so ago, my good friend and I would occasionally take trips to our family's property out in the middle of nowhere. It was fairly remote. You'd had to drive up a dirt road a few miles and couldn't access it unless you had a key to the chain on the gate. There wasn't anyone around for miles. All that was there was a trailer they had towed up and left to sleep in. The feel out there was always a little off. One day, we were wandering around the property, not really thinking of much until about 20 minutes later when we realized we had actually been walking out into the middle of nowhere. We had no water with us and had no clue where we were. Luckily, we found our way back after a while, but neither of us could explain why we did this. I'd also take my voice recorder, and we caught quite a few strange things on it. One day, before heading out there, we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. It was only about a 40-minute drive from the property, so we thought, hey, why don't we go try to find it? We thought it would be cool to say that we had been there. After searching the internet, we found fairly good directions there and headed out for the night. We had a bit of trouble locating it, but after a bit of driving around, we pulled into an area that was spot on from the descriptions we had read. We stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was the mass amounts of bugs swarming us. Only a few short seconds later, we had huge dogs barking, growling, and running at us. We immediately jumped back in the car and took off. We ended up staying in the area for a little longer exploring. Later that night, back at her property, we were sitting around the fire talking. All of a sudden, we started hearing barking. It was rather startling, and she immediately froze and said she had never heard barking in this area before. She isn't one to get scared easily, so her uneasiness put me on the edge. Not too long after that, there was more barking. Very slowly, we were being surrounded by what I assumed were coyotes. We both tried yelling, jumping around and throwing rocks, but that didn't seem to do any good. Never seen coyotes act this way. We were terrified and had no clue what to do. Not really wanting to stick around and find out if they'd get any closer to us, we doused the fire and flipped on our flashlights. She grabbed my hand and we booked it back into the trailer. We were both shaking by the time we made it in, and she locked the door. I don't think either of us slept that well. I heard a lot of weird sounds and felt the sense of dread the entire night. As soon as the sun started to rise, we decided to pack up and get out of there. We need their car, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. On the driver's side car window was a huge handprint made with mud. It was easily twice the size of our hands. We looked at each other and silently agreed that we need to get the hell out of there. I'm not saying it was a skinwalker, but neither of us have been able to explain it, and I've never been back. This happened 2 years ago. I was in England with my Boy Scout troop for a weekend in February. Everything was normal until the second day when it had started to snow really heavily. So me and my two friends, let's call them Matthew and Lewis, decided to go and play hide and seek in the snow. I got all my warm clothes on and snuck out, which wasn't that hard because there was a window in our room. When I got out, they decided that I should be on, so I gave them 3 minutes to hide. After that, I ran in vaguely the same direction that I heard them go in. After about 4 minutes of looking, I was about to give up when I heard a weird mumbling noise. I ran over and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Found you!" But, to my surprise, instead of finding a boy wrapped in winter clothes, I found a small, white humanoid crouched over next to a carcass of what looked like a large dog. I quickly jumped up and ran away. I could hear it right behind me jumping from border to border. Eventually, I could see the hut we were staying in. Then, I did something I wished I hadn't. I turned around. I saw this thing stand up and realized that what I had originally thought to have been small was about the same height as me. I could see its big yellow fangs dripping with warm blood, and his eyes were deep red, and behind the door opened it was my leader. I turned around, and he was mad and asked me where I'd been for so long, and it turned out that I'd been gone for about a half an hour. I went through with them exactly what had happened, and as expected, no one believed me. The rest of the trip was normal, but 3 months later, I was shocked to find out that the exact same place I had been closed by police after a 12-year-old child had went missing for 2 days and had been found on a river, totally mutilated. Apparently, his throat had been ripped open and his intestines had almost been eaten along with half his leg. All I can say is I'm never going back to that place again.
Some background. I live in a rural county in Texas. I live in a rural suburb about 1.5 miles away from my grandparents, who live on an expansive longhorn cattle ranch. My grandparents are currently on a trip to Michigan, and they needed someone to watch their house, take care of their diabetic dog, and water the garden for a while. I love being alone and in the country, and I wouldn't be that far from my mom and stepdad, so I agreed to do it for them. The first 2 days were fine. It was on the third day that this began. It was about 8:30 at night. I had just made myself dinner, a Lunchable, and was ready to sit down in the living room and watch TV for a couple of hours until I went to bed. The recliner I was sat in at my grandparents' living room was directly beside their large glass doors, and I could see into their backyard and into their ranch from my seat. Just past the fence of the backyard were about a dozen deer, which wasn't odd considering there's an insane amount of deer where I live. I watched them for a second, when all of a sudden I felt a wave of fear rush over me. It was like my brain stopped seeing the deer as something harmless, and instead, they became a very imposing sight. I scanned over the deer and my eyes landed on one in particular. I noticed it because even though it was a doe, it was a good bit taller than the others and seemed to be oddly bulky and slightly misshapen. I watched it for about a second before out of nowhere, its head shot up from the grass and it stared directly at me. I hadn't been moving and both my dogs were inside with me asleep, but I knew that it was focusing in on me. We stared for about a second before it started to whip its head around in a really unnatural motion. The closest analogy I could make is when a video game glitches and the head of a character starts moving around wildly. It did this for another second before putting its head back down into the grass like nothing had happened. At this point, I knew something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. I called my mom, who was out fishing with my stepdad, and told her I was going home early because I was freaking out. I suffer from anxiety and can sometimes have panic attacks, so she understood, and I hauled ass to my car. All I grabbed was my phone, my Lunchables, and an Eeyore blanket that I had brought from my house. I don't really know why I grabbed the extra 2 things besides my phone, but I wasn't really thinking clearly. I'm usually a very careful driver, especially on my grandparents' shoddy gravel driveway, but I knew I had to get off their property or else I would be in real danger. My car is shitty, with the driver's side window permanently down. The entire time I drove up their half-mile-long driveway, I heard a sound coming just off from behind my car. It sounded like if a mammal tried to replicate the sound of a cicada. Very throaty and unnatural, and it was the same, constant distance from my car the entire drive off the property. Right in front of the gate before going back out onto the road were a few of my grandparents' cows. I laid eyes on a black figure amongst them, and almost like an optical illusion, it changed to be a full front profile on a longhorn. I wouldn't have thought this with my eyes playing tricks on me, because I was in a panic. If it wasn't for the horns. When I saw the quote-unquote cow, it was a black figure with no horns, but within a second I spotted it. It suddenly had 2 giant horns on either side of its head. I managed to drive home, but I still felt extremely unsafe. My instincts were telling me that if I went inside, I'd be cornering myself. At this point, I was sitting in my driveway, near hysterics, and on the phone with one of my friends, who I'll call Hope. Hope is extremely knowledgeable with this kind of stuff and a true believer in the supernatural, and I knew she would be the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. She talked to me and calmed me down, and I explained the deer to her, and she got pretty freaked out and told me she knew what it probably was. I told her that I didn't want to know because I already had an idea as to what it might be, and her confirmation would only freak me out more. At this point, I made up my mind to go to my closest neighbor's house. I knew if I stayed alone, I would be putting myself in danger. So cue me crying and clutching an Eeyore blanket as I stroll up to my neighbor's backyard, weeping and apologizing profusely. Thankfully, my neighbors are saints, and they took me inside and calmed me down. They stayed up with me for a good hour until my mom and stepdad got home from the lake, and I felt safe enough to go home. Because I had finally fully calmed down, I decided to go back to the ranch with my mom to clean up the mess I had left when I booked it out of there. But by the time we were there, even remotely close to the ranch, I felt the panic return. We got halfway down the driveway before I told my mom I couldn't do it and I had to go back. My mom was still planning to go back after she dropped me off at home, but I knew she'd be in danger if she went back alone. So I told her about the deer, and I told her I really don't want her to go back there that night, and she agreed. Hope has an older sister who's extremely well versed in the supernatural, and when she informed her of my experience, her advice was for me to never go back. This wasn't entirely realistic to me, since they are my grandparents and I did leave most of my stuff there. But I tried to take her warning as seriously as possible and decided to greatly limit my time there and not to go back alone until my grandparents returned. The next day, which is today, at about noon, I had to go back to gather my stuff and check on my grandparents' diabetic dog and let the bigger outside dog in so he would be safe from the heat. The feeling of the place was still tense and strange, but not terrifying. Later, at about 8, I had to go back again, this time to feed the dog, let the other one out, and water the plants. I was way more hesitant about it, but my mom forced me to go. I was keeping my cool pretty well, until, as we were going down the driveway, I saw a deer standing in the road. I immediately felt the fear of the previous night and started freaking out, telling my mom that I couldn't do it and that she had to turn around. As I was freaking out with my mom distracted, trying to calm me down, this fucking deer arches back, like when a cat stretches. That tips me over the edge into full hysterics, but my mom still refused to take me home. My mom went inside my grandparents' house and I stayed in the truck and called Hope again. I told her what I saw. She tried to calm me down, but nothing really worked. As I was freaking out on the phone, I saw a black shadow dart into and then out of the rearview mirror. That was it. I called my mom and was screaming for her to come back inside and take me home. Even during normal panic attacks, it never reaches this point, and my mom was screaming so harshly at my vocal cords hurt. She tried to convince me to come inside, and eventually, she decided to take me home, and I was hyperventilating and sobbing until the moment I arrived back. At this point, I'm terrified and I don't know what to do. I've never experienced anything like this before, and although I hope this is going to be an isolated sense of occurrences, I can't be for sure. For now, I'm going to try to stay away from my grandparents' ranch, but that really isn't realistic. I could use any advice you're willing to give.
It was around 11 p.m. at night. We wanted to visit a graveyard, so we ended up going to Double Butte Cemetery near South Mountain in Phoenix. As we were pulling in, a coyote dashed across the car and ran toward the mountains. It looked weird, like one of those overbred, incest German shepherds that are all short and hunched over. But I didn't think too much of it. We parked and walked away from the car and explored the graveyard. There were no sign of people or coyotes, but whenever we walked near a bush or a tree, we heard rustling. But we figured it was just some sort of rodent or bat. When we were done, we walked toward the car to leave, but we saw a cool little gated sanctuary garden type thing. So we went in there and sat for a little. All of a sudden, we heard what sounded like a weird mix of a laugh, scream, and a howl. I was confused to what this humanist scream was at first, so my mind immediately translated it to multiple coyotes, a pack. We were about to leave, and then we saw 4 sets of glowing eyes, crouching and coming toward us. Fast. I still figured an angry coyote pack, so we ran to the car. After being safe in the car, we got a little more ballsy and tried to find them. They were nowhere to be seen. I saw 3, maybe 4 shadows of human figures on the other side of the graveyard from the car. I thought to myself, wow, there are people here this late? I wonder why we didn't see or hear them. It's a pretty small, flat and treeless graveyard. Basically, just dirt and deserts. So I'm pretty positive we would have known if there were others. Their shadows disappear for a while, but I'm still looking toward that direction. That's when I saw the weirdest figure, hunched over, walking in the most awkward way. The way its body moved was swift and unnatural. It was the same direction where I saw the people. We drove over to that direction and found nothing and left. We get home and we noticed the car scratched up everywhere, like a coyote was going crazy on top of the car. The scratches were long and dragged, in different directions, and a few dirt paw prints all over the car. We had a car wash the next day, and the car was completely untouched before, and I'm pretty sure of that. We also left a McFlurry in the trunk of the car, which was untouched and not moved. If coyotes got on the car, it definitely would have been destroyed, considered how dramatic the scratches were. So yeah, I'm wondering if what we saw were skinwalkers. The graveyard is also near a reservation, and it seemed like a lot of Arizona pioneers and natives were buried there.
Just to clarify, this didn't happen to me. It happened to my girlfriend a year or 2 ago. Nevertheless, I always get freaked out whenever I'm in our woods. There's been 2 incidents, so I'll try to make them quick. One night, she had a few of her friends over, laughing, drinking, and having a good time in general. They did all their little parties in her dad's garage, which was a few yards away from the house. Beyond the garage was an unkept path that led into the woods behind your house. Across from the garage was an old trampoline that was too ripped up to be able to jump on. They decided to head back in when it got dark. My girlfriend has a big black dog. I'm not sure of the breed, but they definitely knew she was inside at the time. Right before entering the house, my girlfriend looked at the trampoline and saw a pair of bright yellow, shining eyes, almost cat-like. She caught friends over, and they saw it too. Her dog, Jasmine, was right behind them in the house. When Jasmine let out a bark, the thing took off at an inhuman speed. The morning after, they found long claw marks on the side of the garage. The second time was when my girlfriend was taking a walk on a small trail through the woods. She has schizophrenia, so she does hallucinate a lot, but she swears that she knew that what she saw was real. About halfway down the trail, through dense shrubbery, she saw a grayish thing. It was walking on all 4s. Its limbs looked twisted, and like it wasn't assembled right, but it definitely looked human to her. She waited for whatever it was to pass before running back home. We never go out to her woods alone anymore, especially at night or without a weapon. She believes her woods belong to wendigos or maybe skinwalkers. She couldn't tell very well. One thing is for certain, something strange is living in her forest. It was around 10 at night, off a little ways from Ocean City, Maryland. It was Mother, her friend, and my sister and I. We were driving home from our vacation, and I asked if we could take the back roads. I always love seeing the woods at night, and it was the scenic route. We were driving down, and although I was one who asked for the trees, I was ironically on my phone texting and listening to music. We eventually came to a stretch of road that I didn't pay much attention to. It was boring, but I occasionally looked up every now and then as I did the entire ride. It was a straight path forward with nothing but streetlights, so we were driving and driving. As we crossed under the lights, it was almost relaxing. I went into a half-sleep trance. Then I suddenly woke up, and everything was fine. More lights as we drove by. No one was talking. My mom's boyfriend wasn't asleep, but there were no muffled conversations. Everything seemed calm. But I had this sudden awareness we were in the middle of the woods. It was dark and around 11:30 or 12. Without streetlights, you couldn't see anything but the stars. I immediately felt very paranoid. I turned my phone on and listened to the music. Then, we entered back to another stretch of light and drove on, and I started to feel a bit better. This part is strange, because it was as if something told me to go to my phone, as if there was a notification. I checked and there was nothing there, and then I noticed something in my obscured vision. There were about 4 lights up ahead that were turned off, in an area where the road kind of turns. It was a fairly wooded area, and you couldn't see much without a light. So we slowed down. I didn't pay much attention to it, but this next part sticks with me. As we slowly approached the next light that was on, something crawled out from the woods and into the light. I looked up and thought it was a deer at first, but it kept moving out. It was limping, but when it fully emerged, what I saw was truly bone-chilling. A naked, ash-white skinny man crawled out on all fours. It stopped, and as I saw it, it turned its head at us. Its eyes were deep charcoal black. We sped it fast and started driving. It wasn't human. As we drove past it, it jumped over a car weightlessly, defying physics. My mom's Mercedes had 2 sunroofs, and although it was a blur, I got a close look at it. As it passed over the car, it landed behind us and faded into the black. The scary part was, when it jumped over our car, our sunroof was open.
My story starts as me and my cousin were home alone on a warm summer's day. She and I were sitting on the living room floor, sewing, as that was the only interesting thing we could do that day. We had a fan in the open window, as it gets really hot in Manchester during the summer. The fan was blowing cool air into the overheated house. I could remember that it was not a windy day whatsoever. Remember this detail, because it is very important throughout the story. Me and my cousin were just sitting there having a conversation about something that I can't specifically remember, when all of a sudden, the fan falls out of the window. It was one of those box-like fans that if I think about it now, even if it was wind, I don't think it would have been strong enough to knock it over. Me and my cousin did think it was a wind at first, so we put the fan back up and continued sewing. Not that long after, I heard a crash and looked up to see the fan had fallen over by itself again. Once again, we chalked it up to the wind and put it back up. But then it happened again. Then again. We started getting a little skeptical and went to see if it was the wind, but there was no wind or nothing. It was a nice, really hot summer's day. Right after that, all of a sudden, all the doors inside the house started opening and closing constantly. We knew for a fact this was not the wind, as even the doors in the outside of the house were opening, like the bedroom doors, the laundry room door, the front door, and the garage door, etc. We got a little spooked out, so my cousin ended up calling her ex-boyfriend's mum, who according to my cousin was a spiritual person and knew about this kind of stuff. This lady ended up answering the phone, and we quickly explained to her what was happening. She told us that we had to go find a Bible. I obediently went into my grandparents' room because I knew they had a few different Bibles in their closet. Once we got the Bible, the lady on the phone told us that we had to open it to a random page, then join hands. We joined hands, then the lady told us to repeat after her. She then started saying some type of prayer that I never heard before. We did as she asked and repeated a prayer. The doors started opening and closing faster and more violently as we kept saying the prayer. Then all of a sudden, the strangest thing ended up happening. The second we said the final word of the prayer, everything just stopped. Got quiet. Everything went back to normal. This event has impacted me in quite a few different ways. I started becoming way more interested in all things paranormal and supernatural. I researched and found out all the information I could on all things paranormal. From all the research I have done, I have concluded that what was in that house was something called a poltergeist. A poltergeist is a type of ghost that is able to move or throw things and is also capable of making really loud noises. This is the only type of ghost I could figure out that can move all those doors. I have since been back to that house, but also with equipment I have rather made or purchased online. I have also experienced other things from doing this type of stuff. I think this experience will impact my life forever.
I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Many times when you would ask natives about skinwalkers, they would get upset and would mostly refuse to even mention the word. My aunt went to a basketball game with the team my uncle was training. She stepped in since he was out sick. The game was on a reservation, and they were on a dirt road heading home around 8 at night, and she said an old woman started floating next to the van, and everyone started to scream. She told everyone in the car to pray, and she said that's when the old woman floated off into the dark. Nobody stopped praying until they got to the meeting line where she dropped off the kids. Another story was from my friend Raiden. He told me that they were at his grandma's house watching TV at night. We heard knocking on the door. He went to go answer it and his grandparents yelled at him not to, saying that nobody comes out this late except for skinwalkers. He said after that, they heard knocking on the walls and the windows had doors that you could shut from the inside, so he never saw anything. He said the next day, he heard the walker get on top of their trailer outside and start thumping on it. Next day they came out, the roof was dented to hell. My friend Anthony told me a story of how him and his brothers were outside with their uncle, and they saw a skinwalker with blood-red eyes and pale white skin, but the face looked like a pig's. They said they sat there frozen. And they said that their uncle also froze in his spot after making direct eye contact with the walker, and the walker started walking towards them, and they said that they grabbed their uncle and dragged him inside and locked everything and then called the cops. Some pretty terrifying shit. I wouldn't go searching for any of these things. This happened when I was around the age of 7. I wasn't alone when I saw it. I'll just call them Kat, Riley, and my sister Lily. It was years ago, so my memory may be a little hazy, but I still remember a lot from that day. Riley was our next door neighbor, and Kat lived up the street. Remember, we live in Montana in a countryside, and have seen many spiders like the barn spider and hairy brown spider. The four of us were playing that very day, but then we went into the house that me and my sister lived in at the time. I don't remember exactly why, but we went outside for a little bit. My mom was speaking to someone, and we were heading for the door. We opened the door, then one of us closed the door. Only a few seconds after, we then realized the spider was not in our view, but then we all stood there in fear. It wasn't a normal spider. Its body must have been almost the size of a baby, while its legs were much longer. It quickly went away out of sight. Then my mom, only half a minute later, or some seconds later, says she saw the big spider crawl from the back door. I think, even up to this day, that it was literally on the door. But I'm just glad none of us got bitten by that son of a bitch. It was massive. I'm not sure exactly what to think of it.